All right, and right now we want to take you. This is Brad Wall, Saskatchewan Premier, live, providing the latest update from the Premier's meeting. Let's listen.
Specifics of that work tomorrow when we're talking about trade issues, including internal trade issues, which we move till tomorrow's agenda. So some of the specifics around the employment insurance program, I think you heard Premier saying going into the meeting that we need to modernize the employment insurance program, and modernization has to include a bigger emphasis on training. Right now, the requirement of the employment insurance program is that about 0.8% of contributions must by law go to training. We're not even doing that right now in the country. It's about 0.5%. So even beyond going to the full allocation of 0.8, premiers are saying, let's actually, if it takes legislation, let's do it. As a country, let's lift the ceiling on the amount that can go into training. This is obviously an urgent need too, as people, including those who are mature workers, are looking to retrain to take advantage of some work. We talk about the need for EI support to be equitable for Canadians regardless of where they live. And you may recognize a lot of the principles that we're going to be sending, that we've iterated in this press release and we'll be sending to Ottawa, similar to what the Western Premiers agreed to in Yukon this year. Certainly this was one of them. While the number of regions is not specific in this particular communique, I can tell you that we're pretty clear in our advice and recommendation to the expert panel that the program needs to be streamlined. It needs to be simplified for Canadians, and that means less than 58 different regions. Some of the premiers would tell a story of two employees working for the same company, living in the same area of their province, worked for the company for the same period of time, were unfortunately laid off, and one can qualify for EI for 10 weeks less than the other because he lives in a different region. I guess that's what when you hear Premier McGuinty very effectively calling for this program to be urgent, this program to be able to urgently address needs that are there now. That's the kind of thing that he's talking about, and that we're talking about in our advice to the government. We're also what's very important for premiers is that the reforms ought not to reduce access or benefits from the current standards. And finally, this is a national program, but it needs to be affordable and sustainable, and it really needs to be separate from federal government proper. I think a separation and distinction even beyond where it is now as a fund is important. So there is that transparency, and I frankly think there's a greater chance for innovation if it's improved innovation if it's separate. With respect to the pension issue, premiers have been talking about this. Finance ministers of the provinces have been talking about the fact that for about a third of Canadians, according to 2007 statistics, a third of Canadians who are in the private sector making between $30,000 and $100,000, there's a real likelihood for them that they're not going to have adequate retirement. There are some options out there. In our province, it's a modest provision perhaps, but for about 23 years we've been offering the Saskatchewan pension plan as a supplement to those who may not be able to access a workplace plan. There might be improvements to existing pension plans that can come from a summit that we're calling for to be held very soon to deal with the issue of retirement pensions in the country. And I would be happy to do my best to answer any questions that you have today.
So there's no particular number that you came up with. Premier McGuinty said yesterday 420. Michael Matty has got this. There's no particular number.
Well, there's like you've heard premiers today say, and probably you've covered many of these in the past at other meetings as well, it's a big country. And there are very different economies across Canada. There are different economic realities. And so I think it's an important step for the premiers to say, look, I mean, in terms of the number of regions, 58's not enough. There might be a compromise somewhere between the two in terms of the hours of qualification between some of the two numbers that have been thrown around. But no, the short answer is we don't have a specific number in terms of qualification. Again, it's a big country, and the regional economies are very, very different, and the regional demands of the employment insurance program are different.
But if you guys cannot agree on a number, how do you expect the federal government to come up with one?
I think, first of all, that's part of the federal government's job, I think. I think it is part of the job of provinces to say, in a very constructive way, and I think quite specifically, look, we've come up with a consensus here, notwithstanding the fact that, and I do work for the people of the province of Saskatchewan, and Premier McGuinty works for the people of the province of Ontario, And so there's going to be different priorities when it comes to employment insurance or any federal program. That's just the nature of the federation. The strength of this particular federation, though, is that the premiers, the women and men in that room today, were wanting to work towards where we could find consensus, I think, to be a help to the federal government process as they look to improve employment insurance. And, you know, we talked very specifically about training today. I hope this will be helpful to the expert panel, to the both to the federal opposition and the federal government. If you want to fix something quickly in employment insurance, let's have a bigger emphasis on training. So if you have, heaven forbid, if you've lost a job, you can access some training that might transition you to something where there is opportunities, and maybe to a region where there's opportunities.
Was this just a reflection of how difficult it was to find people?
Sorry, I'll go Brian and then James. Sorry.
I just wanted to ask you why you think the approach should be more self-sustaining. Do you have concerns that it's supposed to be paid to
Right. Well, and we know the surplus is there. No, I don't think there's a concern necessarily about the sustainability of it. I think to the extent it's separate, and the Premier's thinking here was to the extent it is more separate from the federal government, I think there's a chance, frankly, for some more innovation, number one. But number two, there's just just no likelihood of all down the road that any federal government would want to do anything but the objectives of employment insurance with that particular fund. We've done that with some provincial agencies as a relatively new government, and I'm glad we did because that distance, I think, sometimes can help. I got James.
Well, how reflective of this is the divisions that you can't come up with a number? How much division is there amongst the provinces on this, and why should the federal government and the federal Liberals take the Premier seriously if you can't come up with a number for either the number of tiers or the threshold?
You know, I think the federal politicians understand provincial politics, and I think they understand that in that room today there was an individual who was working very hard to represent the interests of Canada, but also the interests of the people of Prince Edward Island that have a completely different economy, much more seasonal in a lot of sectors than, say, for example, those in British Columbia or in Saskatoon or Regina. That's the nature of the country. We get strength from that diversity, though, as well. And to the extent we can come together as premiers and say, look, we need to make some fundamental changes in terms of an emphasis on training, and at least to suggest 58 regions is too much. The Western premiers have suggested 3, not regions, but 3 categories, and we'll still go forward with that presentation as well. But I think this is progress. Julie, and then right here.
Talking about increasing its allocation to training, obviously you need more money. How
Right.
much more money, and training for what? What kind of training?
Well, what the provision that I'm talking about here, there's a provision in employment insurance that requires 0.8% of contributions that exist today. So this doesn't necessarily require more general revenue fund money, but 0.8% today can be invested in training. We're not even doing that in the country right now. We're doing about between 0.5 and 0.6. We think the premiers had that information today. So not only can we move up to the full training allocation, we're saying maybe it's time the legislation, maybe it's time EI be changed to increase that cap. I think that, you know, less than 1% of contributions to be used for training is just far too low. As we want to transition to what's next, to the knowledge economy, we want to make sure that I think that training is an absolute priority of these, that it truly is a temporary bridge. Employment insurance, the premiers believe, should be a temporary bridge to another job, and maybe that or another career.
You decide what jobs, though. Where are the jobs? Training for what?
Well, you know, we're going to talk tomorrow. We did already today, and we'll have some communique information around the green economy, around an innovation agenda that each province is pursuing with different strengths. There are opportunities today in the province of Saskatchewan. I think there's over 4,500 jobs on saskjobs.ca. That's www.saskjobs.ca. And so I'm saying, but that's just today. We're also have to plan for the future, and I think that's what premiers were doing with the EI and the recommendations on training. We'll go here and then here.
On the pension front, did you come up with any specifics? Because some provinces are talking about a provincial equivalent of CPP, other provinces are talking about a provincial equivalent of an RSP, sort of an encouragement to save on your own. What's the consensus if there's any?
Well, first of all, what this calls for is a summit on the issue, because you're right, there are some different views. I think, though, that they're really, from what I heard on an initial sort of cut at this thing, is that premiers are going to be open to other ideas, even from what they might have come into that particular discussion thinking about. Again, Saskatchewan, I'll tell you that BC, Alberta, and Saskatchewan, as a result of a joint cabinet meeting that we had, we're looking at this very issue as well together, and we've sort of put those efforts on hold pending this national initiative. And I think there are a number of different options, and that's what we want to explore at the summit right here.